you want to be wealthy and happy the rest of your life, just learn this lesson well.
Sometime in the last few years, something started to feel off. Not just for one country or one generation, but for people in nearly every corner of the world. Groceries cost more, rent went up. The idea of buying a home began to feel like a distant aspiration rather than a realistic plan. People who had done everything right, finished school, found steady work, lived within their means, looked at their bank accounts and wondered why it was never quite enough. And then they opened their phones, and they saw the headlines. Elon Musk becomes the world's first trillionaire. Jeff Bezos builds a super yacht so large it requires its own support yacht. The global billionaire population added more wealth in the last 5 years than in the previous 2 decades combined. 2 realities, 1 world, running in parallel. So the question is not just how the wealthy got wealthier. The more unsettling question is this: were these 2 realities connected? Did the same forces that inflated billionaire fortunes also make it harder for the ordinary people to get ahead? The answer, it turns out, is more complicated and more important than most people realize. If you enjoy stories about the decisions, strategies, and turning points that shape our world, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more to come. To understand how we got here, you first have to understand how wealth actually accumulates at the highest levels. Most people build financial security through income, a salary, an hourly wage, a paycheck that arrives at the end of the week. That income pays for housing, food, transportation, and if there is anything left over, savings. The relationship is linear. You work, you earn, you spend, you save. Progress is measured in small increments. Billionaires operate under an almost entirely different logic. The defining characteristic of extreme wealth is not a very large salary, it is asset ownership. Stocks, businesses, real estate, intellectual property. These are instruments that generate returns whether or not their owner is actively working. A billionaire's net worth is not a number sitting in a bank account, it's a valuation. A snapshot of what the market currently believes their ownership stakes are worth. This distinction matters enormously. When Elon Musk's wealth is reported as $200 billion, that number largely represents the value the market assigns to his shares in SpaceX, Tesla, and other ventures. When those companies become more valuable, his paper wealth increases, sometimes by tens of billions of dollars in a single trading day. When they fall, it decreases just as quickly. But the key insight is that the underlying mechanism, owning a stake in something that compounds in value over time, is fundamentally different from earning a wage that must be spent to survive. Economists have a word for this distinction. They call it the difference between capital and labor. Labor earns returns through active participation. Capital earns returns through ownership. And one of the most durable observations in modern economics is that over long periods of time, the returns from capital consistently outpace the returns from labor. Assets tend to appreciate faster than wages grow. Ownership tends to compound. Work in the purely financial sense does not. This is not a new observation. The French economist Tom Piketty built an entire influential book about it in 2013. But understanding the principle is different from witnessing what happens when the conditions for capital accumulation become extraordinarily favorable in a very short period of time, which is exactly what happened next. The story of modern wealth inequality has 2 major catalysts, and both of them were responses to catastrophe. The first was the financial crisis of 2008. When the global banking system came close to collapsing under the weight of its own speculative excess, governments and central banks around the world faced an impossible choice: allow the system to fail and risk a second Great Depression, or intervene at a scale never before attempted in peacetime and accept the long-term consequences of doing so. They chose to intervene. The Federal Reserve in the United States cut interest rates to near zero and launched a program called quantitative easing, a technical term for a process that, in simplified terms, involved creating new money and using it to purchase financial assets. The goal was to lower borrowing costs, stabilize the banking system, and stimulate economic activity. Other central banks around the world followed similar paths. It worked in the immediate sense. the financial system stabilized, the economy recovered, a depression was avoided. But there was a consequence that took years to fully appreciate. When central banks purchase assets and suppress interest rates, the value of existing assets tends to rise. Stocks become more attractive. Real estate becomes more valuable. Bonds appreciate. And the people who own the most assets benefit the most from that appreciation. In 2008, the bottom 60% of Americans held roughly 2% of the country's financial wealth. They had almost nothing to appreciate. The second catalyst arrived in 2020, and it was larger by almost every measure. When the COVID-19 pandemic forced the global economy into sudden paralysis, the policy response was unprecedented. The United States alone injected trillions of dollars into stimulus spending, expanded unemployment programs, distributed direct payments to households, and once again cut interest rates to near zero. Other major economies followed suit. The scale of money creation in 2020 and 2021 exceeded anything seen in the modern financial history. Markets, which had crashed sharply in March of 2020, recovered within months, and they did something almost no one had predicted. They soared to record highs. The rocket fuel had been lit, and the assets were about to launch. What followed was one of the most dramatic concentrations of wealth in recorded history. Between March 2020 and the end of 2021, the world's billionaires added more than $5 trillion to their combined net worth. That number is so large it resists easy comprehension. To put it in perspective, $5 trillion is roughly the annual economic output of Japan, the third largest economy on Earth, accumulated by a few hundred individuals in under 2 years. At the center of this explosion was technology. The pandemic didn't just accelerate the adoption of digital services, it essentially compressed a decade of digital transformation into 18 months. Suddenly, remote work was mandatory. E-commerce was essential. Streaming was the primary form of entertainment. Cloud computing became critical infrastructure. And the companies that owned these platforms saw their valuations multiply at a rate their founders had never imagined. Amazon's stock more than doubled between early 2020 and mid-2021. Jeff Bezos, who already owned a significant stake in the company, saw his personal wealth increase by tens of billions of dollars during a period when millions of Amazon's warehouse workers were classified as essential workers and paid hourly wages. Tesla went further. The company's stock increased by more than 700% in 2020 alone, a single-year return that belongs in a category by itself. Elon Musk, who owned a substantial portion of Tesla, went from being wealthy to being incomprehensibly wealthy in the space of months. NVIDIA, the semiconductor company whose chips became the essential hardware for artificial intelligence, saw its value increase from roughly $300 billion in early 2023 to over $3 trillion by 2024, making it briefly the most valuable company in the world and minting paper wealth for its founders and early shareholders at a speed the financial world had never quite witnessed. The mechanism behind all this was not complicated. These companies benefited from what are called network effects, the phenomenon where a platform becomes exponentially more valuable as more people use it. Google becomes more useful as more people search. Amazon becomes more efficient as more sellers and buyers join. These dynamics create natural monopolies, and natural monopolies generate extraordinary profits that flow disproportionately to the people who own meaningful equity stakes. There is nothing illegal about this. In most cases, there is nothing even particularly surprising about it in retrospect. But the speed and scale at which it unfolded, turbocharged by a tsunami of central bank liquidity and a forced global shift to digital everything, created a wealth event unlike anything in the modern era. While asset prices were soaring, something very different was happening at the other end of the economic spectrum. The same monetary policies that inflated stock markets and real estate valuations eventually produced a consequence that central banks had spent years trying to generate and then found themselves unable to control: inflation. By 2021 and into 2022, prices were rising at rates not seen since the 1980s. Food, energy, rent, the cost of buying a car, all of it moved sharply upward. In the United States, inflation peaked at over 9% in mid-2022. In the United Kingdom, it touched 11%. and many emerging markets it went higher still. For people whose wealth existed primarily in financial assets, inflation was uncomfortable but manageable. Their portfolios had appreciated far faster than prices had risen. Their real wealth, adjusted for purchasing power, remained intact or had grown. For people whose financial position consisted mainly of a paycheck, inflation was something else entirely. It was a cut in real wages, an invisible reduction in what their income could actually buy, and it arrived on top of trends that had been building for decades. Wage growth in developed economies had been sluggish for the better part of 30 years. Productivity had increased significantly across most sectors, but the gains had flowed disproportionately to shareholders and executives rather than to the broader workforce. The social contracts that had supported the post-war middle class, stable employment, defined pensions, affordable housing, accessible education, had gradually eroded. Housing told the sharpest story. In city after city across North America, Europe, and Australia, residential property prices had risen so dramatically that homeownership was no longer a realistic goal for a significant portion of the working population. In London, Toronto, Sydney, San Francisco, median home prices exceeded 10 times the median annual income. The traditional milestone of homeownership, the most reliable mechanism through which ordinary families had historically accumulated wealth, was quietly closing off for an entire generation. The irony was almost architectural. The same low interest rate environment that had inflated stock portfolios had also driven property prices beyond the reach of first-time buyers who needed to borrow money at those same low rates to purchase their first home. Asset owners benefited from rising valuations on what they already held. Those without assets found the entry price rising faster than they could save. The gap between these two experiences, owning capital versus selling labor, widened into something measurable, visible, and increasingly difficult to ignore. So where does that leave us? There is a version of this story that reads as pure inevitability. Capitalism rewards ownership. Technology creates winner-take-all dynamics. Central banks respond to crises with tools available to them. The wealthy were positioned to benefit because they had already accumulated the assets that these forces rewarded. It is a system functioning more or less as designed. But there is another version, one that asks whether a system producing these outcomes, where crisis responses consistently amplify the advantages of those who least need them, and where the distance between ownership and ordinary life becomes structurally uncrossable, is a system that can sustain itself. History suggests that extreme concentrations of wealth tend to precede disruption. The Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era and the New Deal. Post-war prosperity in the developed world was built on deliberate policies of redistribution, public investment, and labor protection. These were not accidents. They were corrections, chosen or forced, to imbalances that had become too large to ignore. Whether the current era is approaching a similar inflection point is a question no one can answer with confidence. The forces driving billionaire wealth accumulation, technology, globalization, monetary policy, the compounding of logic of asset ownership, remain largely intact. But so does the frustration. The quiet arithmetic that tells millions of people each morning that working harder is not the same as getting ahead. How that tension resolves, whether through policy, through markets, or through something more unpredictable, may well be the defining economic story of the coming decade. And like all the most important stories, we will probably only fully understand it looking back. In retrospect, stories behind the decisions, secrets, and turning points that shape our world.